All right, guys, so we talked about the different regions that were created with our colonies, and now we're going to really talk about what life was like in the colonies. So obviously, they didn't have like malls or the ability to go on the internet and shop, but they still had things that they needed, and they still wanted to improve their lives and improve the things that they had. And so they found different ways to do this. They used the land and the natural resources they really had to figure out what they could offer and use to improve their life. So a lot of them lived and worked on farms still at this point. They grew a lot of what they needed and then sold the rest and used it to pay for the other things they needed. Things like tools, salts, gunpowder, things like that. They also bartered with like their neighbors. Bartering just means like trading one good for another good. And they usually, found jobs that were in relation to the area that they lived in. So, for example, in New England, they really took advantage of the ocean up there and made a lot of money off of the things they were able to do in the ocean. They caught and sold fish. Whale hunting was huge because you could do so much with the whale. You could use it to make lamp oil, candles, perfume. So, whale hunting was big. Shipbuilders were cutting down timber in the area and building ships and selling them. So, that was really huge. In the middle colonies, they really were able to focus on trading. Their system of rivers and the connections that they had made it so easy for them to be able to work as merchants and traders. So some people worked there doing the trades, and then some people worked there just unloading the ships and things like that. Sometimes people would change the land to fit what they needed. So, for example, creating river dams started happening around this time because they would then use the fast moving water to power their mills. And so they were building these grist mills close to rivers and streams and using dams to change the water in the way they needed to. And then that water would power the wheel that would then grind the wheat into flour. So that was also something that was happening at that point. We had imports and exports going on here. So imports is something that we buy from another country. Exports are something that we sell to another country. So we were doing pretty well with this, but England was doing what England does and deciding that they should control the colonies and what they were trading. So originally this started with them just saying, hey, you really want to trade with us. You should really send us all of these materials you have. You don't need to like make anything with them. Like just send us the wood, send us this, send us that, right? And then once they would get the wood, they would then make the furniture with the wood and sell it at a higher price. And so they were doing this commonly, and they really wanted the colonies to only trade with England. They did not want them talking to other countries. And so they started doing what's called protectionism, which is basically where they kind of forced the colonies into a position where they were relying on England. England really believed in mercantilism, which is basically the concept that if you are if you're exporting more than you're importing, right? So you're selling to another country more than you're buying from them, then you're going to make this giant amount of money, right? So that was a really popular concept at the time. But eventually we ended up with a triangular trade pattern. So ships would come from Africa to America, most of the time carrying slaves. Then they would pick up the wood and the materials that were getting sent to England. They would go to England. England would pack the furniture or whatever they made on there, and it would just continue in this triangular fashion. No matter what, all the tradespeople were getting rich. They were making plenty of money. We started having artisans and craft people though. We started kind of realizing that we could make things too. We didn't have to just send over raw materials. And so we started kind of creating things. We started having craftspeople who would do blacksmiths and carpenters and wig makers, basket makers, tinsmiths. So they were making things out of the things that they had. They were artisans. It was considered kind of like a special, almost like an artistic skill to be able to take a raw material and then put it in use as something else. And so those skills began to grow, and people were making luxury goods. They were making watches. They were having silversmiths, so making, pretty things out of silver. And so those were a really big deal at the time and were growing significantly. At this time, we also started having a class system within the colonies. And so the highest class was your wealthiest people. They were called the gentry. They owned lots of land. They were huge time merchants as well as like big church officials. And a lot of time, your government and community leaders came from this class. The largest amount of colonial people belonged to the middle class. So they had some money. They, had small farms. They kept shops. They were the artisans. And so they weren't rich, but they could get by. They could survive. And all of the middle class men were able to vote. But the lower class were your people that were just like your ordinary workers, right? They didn't own the store. They were working at the store. They didn't own the farm. They were working on the farm. And so they were not making very much money at all. And that group was not even allowed to vote. So that was how that was. You could move up classes, but it had to be some really hard work that went into that. As far as daily life goes, chores were huge. Women and children basically handled all of that. Sometimes men would, depending on their schedule and depending on like what chores they had, right? Like, did they have a cow and did they have any kind of farmland that they were growing food in? But like women usually handled making clothes, making candles, things like that. They would grow some food and preserve it in cans and things like that. They would cook all the food. It was the woman's job to take care of the children. This was kind of crazy when you think of the fact that back then we had quite a few families that had like more than 12 children. That's a lot of children to take care of. So the children would end up start doing the chores as they grew older and would help out around the house. But usually by the age of 12, they were being sent away to go and get some training in some kind of trade so that they would then be able to start working and earning money for the family. When they did have time to play, the toys were super simple. Like we're talking a hoop or like a little doll made from a corn husk. So very simple things. Some kids went to school. They were required to have schools in New England. A lot of the colonies had it too, but the kids were often just given lessons at home. And most kids left schooling before they were a teenager because they started working and earning money for the house. Very few kids went to college at this point. So religion was always important to colonial life. We know that it's kind of their whole thing. But at this point, we started having this new thing called, in the 1730s, that was called the Great Awakening. And it was kind of crazy. Basically, preachers would travel all through the colonies and they would give these really fiery speeches and they were all worked up and they would get the people all worked up. And the whole point was basically that like you should have your own connection with God and that, all of this church stuff, they didn't need to tell you how to live and how to worship. So it started really taking power away from some of the church leaders. And that pretty much sums up our chapter.